For 28 years, he mopped floors at the VA hospital in San Antonio. Night shift. Midnight to 8 a.m. While doctors saved lives and nurses worked miracles, Daniel Brooks pushed a mop cart through empty hallways, his footsteps echoing on linoleum that never stayed clean. Nobody knew his name. Nobody asked his story. He was just the janitor. Invisible, forgettable, beneath notice. Until the night a wounded soldier was wheeled into emergency with shrapnel in his chest and a ranger tab tattooed on his shoulder. The young man was delirious with pain, but when he saw the old janitor standing in the corner, he locked eyes, straightened despite his wounds, and said 3 words that made every doctor in that room stop cold. "Ranger up, Sergeant Major." 3:47 a.m. The graveyard shift. Daniel Brooks emptied the trash can outside room 247. His movements methodical, economical, perfected by 28 years of repetition. At 65, his back complained more than it used to, and his knees had their own opinions about kneeling to scrub baseboards. But the work got done. It always got done. He was a big man. 6'2", broad shoulders that age had rounded but not broken, hands that were made for harder work than pushing mops. His dark skin showed every one of his 65 years, deep lines around his eyes from squinting into sun and wind and things he didn't talk about. His salt and pepper hair was cut military short, a habit from another life that never quite left. He wore navy blue hospital maintenance coveralls with D. Brooks stitched on the pocket, steel-toed boots, rubber gloves, a hospital ID badge that identified him as maintenance staff, night shift. Nothing about him suggested that he was anything other than what he appeared to be, a man who cleaned up other people's messes for minimum wage and never complained. The VA hospital was quiet at this hour, most patients sleeping, nurses moving like ghosts between rooms, doctors catching naps in the break room between emergencies. The night shift was Brooks's domain, the time when the hospital belonged to people like him, the invisible workers who kept everything running while everyone else slept. He'd learned to be invisible long before he started mopping floors, some skills you never lost. His cart rattled as he pushed it down the hallway, mop bucket, cleaning supplies, trash bags, disinfectant. The wheels needed oil, but maintenance kept putting it off. Brooks didn't complain. He just pushed harder. That was the job. Show up, do the work, go home, repeat. 28 years, 10,000 nights, 280,000 hours of mopping the same floors, emptying the same trash cans, cleaning the same bathrooms. Most people would have gone crazy. But Brooks understood something about repetitive work. It was meditative. It gave you time to think. Or, more importantly, time to not think. Because if you thought too much, you remembered. And if you remembered, you couldn't mop floors at 3:47 a.m. without wanting to scream. So, he didn't think. He just worked. The PA system crackled to life. Trauma incoming. GSW to the chest. ETA 4 minutes. All available personnel to emergency. Brooks paused. GSW meant gunshot wound. Not uncommon at a VA hospital in San Antonio. Too many veterans with too many demons and too many guns. But something about the announcement made him stop. The tone of voice. The urgency. He wasn't medical staff. He had no business in emergency. But his feet were already moving that direction, pushing his cart against the current of nurses and doctors rushing toward the ambulance bay. Old habits. By the time he reached emergency, the controlled chaos was in full swing. The ambulance had arrived. Paramedics were wheeling in a stretcher. Brooks stayed back, out of the way, watching from the corner near the supply closet. Nobody noticed him. Nobody ever did. The wounded soldier on the stretcher was young, maybe 25, white kid, buzz cut, athletic build visible even through the trauma. His ACU uniform was soaked with blood. His face was gray with shock. Shrapnel wounds across his chest and shoulder. Multiple entry points, irregular edges. IED blast, Brooks's brain cataloged automatically. Vehicle-borne, judging by the fragmentation pattern. The kid was conscious. Barely. His eyes were unfocused, tracking lights and movement without comprehension. He was mumbling something, the same words over and over, but Brooks couldn't hear from this distance. Corporal Travis Walker, one of the paramedics, was saying. Medevast from Ramstein. IED strike in Syria. 3 KIA. He's the only survivor. Shrapnel in chest cavity, possible pneumothorax, significant blood loss. The medical team swarmed. IV lines, monitors, someone cutting away his uniform. The organized chaos of trauma response that Brooks had seen 1,000 times in 28 years. But then he saw something that made his breath catch. As they cut away the kid's uniform sleeve, exposing his right shoulder, Brooks saw the tattoo. Black and gold, instantly recognizable to anyone who'd earned the right to wear one. A Ranger tab. Below it, dates 2019-2020, Rip Rasp, and below that, a quote, Rangers lead the way. Brooks's hand tightened on his mop handle. His heart rate kicked up for the first time in years. 28 years of careful invisibility, and this kid's tattoo was threatening to blow it all apart. Because Brooks knew that tattoo, knew what it meant, knew what it cost, the kid's eyes suddenly focused. Through the pain and the drugs and the trauma, he was searching for something. His head turned, scanning the room, desperate, and then he saw Brooks, standing in the corner, mop in hand, invisible janitor. Nobody important. The kid's eyes locked onto him. Recognition flashed across his face, not of Brooks specifically, but of something about him, something in his bearing, his posture. The way he stood, the kid tried to sit up. The doctors pushed him back down. But he was fighting them, trying to get the words out, trying to make them understand. Ranger, up, he gasped. Sergeant, Major. The room went quiet. Every doctor, every nurse turned to look where the kid was looking. At Brooks. The janitor. Brooks's jaw tightened. 28 years of anonymity, gone in 3 words. The kid's right hand went to his chest. Not to his wounds, but to his heart. Then slowly, despite the pain, despite the tubes and wires, he moved his hand upward. Toward his forehead, he was trying to salute. Sergeant Major, he said again, clearer now. Rangers, lead the way. One of the older nurses, Margaret, who'd been here almost as long as Brooks, looked at the janitor in the corner with new eyes. Daniel, what's he talking about? Brooks set down his mop. Carefully, precisely, the way a soldier sets down a weapon before walking into something he can't walk away from. He's delirious, Brooks said quietly. I should get back to... No. The kid's voice was stronger now, fueled by desperation or recognition or pain-induced clarity. You're him. You're Sergeant Major Brooks. I've seen your picture in the Ranger Hall of Fame. You trained my platoon sergeant. He showed me. He said... The kid coughed, blood on his lips. He said you were the hardest instructor in Ranger School history. He said you graduated 73 classes. He said... The kid's eyes rolled back. Monitors started beeping. The medical team moved fast, pushing Brooks out of the way as they worked to stabilize their patient, but the damage was done. Margaret was staring at Brooks. So was the young doctor. Army Reserve, probably deployed before medical school. So were the 3 other nurses and the EMT who was still filling out paperwork. Daniel? Margaret said slowly. Is that true? Are you a ranger? Brooks looked at the floor, at his mop bucket. at 28 years of careful invisibility evaporating like morning fog. Was, he said finally. Long time ago. How long ago? Retired 1997, Sergeant Major, 75th Ranger Regiment, Ranger Training Brigade. He paused. Instructor for 23 years. Trained. He did the math in his head. Approximately 4,800 students, 73 classes, give or take. The young doctor stepped forward. Sergeant Major Brooks. He said it like a question, like he was testing whether the words fit. I'm Captain Martinez, Army Reserve. I went through Ranger School in 2015, Class 08 to 15. Our RIs talked about you. They called you the Standard. They said nobody made it through your classes without being broken down and rebuilt. They said you were a legend. Brooks picked up his mop. That was a long time ago, Captain. Why didn't you ever mention, because it's not relevant to mopping floors? Brooks's voice was flat, emotionless. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have bathrooms to clean. He walked out of emergency, pushing his cart, leaving a room full of stunned people in his wake. But he knew it wasn't over. The kid had opened a door that Brooks had spent 28 years keeping closed, and doors, once opened, were hard to shut again. If this story of invisible service and unexpected recognition already has your attention, hit that like button and subscribe. What happens when this humble janitor reveals why a dying ranger would salute him will remind you that the greatest teachers never stop serving. They just change uniforms. Now, let's go to that hospital where the night shift was about to get a lot more interesting. Brooks had tried not to remember. For 28 years, he'd pushed the memories down, buried them under routine and repetition and the steady, numbing work of cleaning up after other people. But now, walking through the empty hallways with his mop cart at 4 a.m., the memories came anyway. Fort Benning, Georgia. 1974, 22 years old, fresh from Vietnam with a combat infantryman badge and a head full of things he couldn't talk about. The Army had given him options: get out or become an instructor. Teach the next generation. Pass on what you learned in the jungle. He'd chosen instructor, because what else was he going to do? Go home to Mississippi and pretend he was normal? Get a job at a factory and spend every night drinking away the memories? At least as a ranger instructor, the nightmares had a purpose. For 23 years, he'd trained men to survive, to fight, to lead, to endure things that would break normal people. He'd taken soft civilians and forged them into rangers. He'd screamed in their faces during mountain phase. He'd watched them hallucinate from exhaustion during Florida phase. He'd failed men who couldn't meet the standard and graduated men who'd earned the right to wear the tab, 73 classes. 4,800 students. Some became officers, generals, heroes. Some died in combat. Some washed out. Some succeeded. All of them, every single one, had passed through his hands at some point in their ranger school journey. He'd been good at it. The best, according to the brass. The Standard, they'd called him. Because you didn't graduate Sergeant Major Brooks' class unless you'd proven you could meet the Ranger standard. Not the minimum standard. The actual standard. The one that kept you alive in combat. He'd retired in 1997 at age 45. Full pension. 23 years of service. They'd wanted him to stay. Offered him positions at Ranger Regiment, at the school, at Fort Benning. But he was done. Burned out. Exhausted by 2 decades of molding human beings into weapons. He'd come to San Antonio because it was far from Fort Benning and close to nothing that mattered. He'd taken the janitor job at the VA because it was available, because it paid enough, and because nobody asked questions. For 28 years, he'd been nobody. Just a guy who mopped floors. And it had been exactly what he needed, until tonight. Until a kid with a ranger tab recognized something about him that should have been invisible. Brooks arrived for his shift expecting, he didn't know what, an article in the employee newsletter, questions from coworkers, something. Instead, he found 12 soldiers waiting in the employee parking lot. They were in civilian clothes, but he could tell they were military from 50 yards away. The way they stood, the way they carried themselves, the haircuts, the bearing, and every single one of them had Ranger tabs tattooed somewhere visible. The closest one stepped forward. Hispanic kid, maybe 30. Fit, confident, respectful distance maintained. Sergeant Major Brooks? I'm not a sergeant major anymore. I'm a janitor. With respect, sir, you'll always be a sergeant major. Once a ranger, always a ranger. The kid extended his hand. Staff Sergeant Carlos Ruiz, 1st Battalion, 75th, Class 02-16. You flunked me on my first peer evaluation. Made me repeat mountain phase. I graduated second time through. Brooks took the hand, shook it. I remember. You were lazy on patrol base operations. Fixed it, obviously. Because you made me understand that lazy gets people killed. Ruiz gestured to the men behind him. These are all Rangers. All graduated within the last 10 years. All heard stories about you from their RIs. When word spread that you were here, working at this hospital. Sir, we had to come. Why? A black soldier stepped forward. Older, maybe 35. Multiple deployment patches. Because you taught our instructors. Which means you taught us. And because Corporal Walker, the kid from last night, is one of ours. He's stable now, by the way. Going to make it. But he told us. Sir, he told us that you walked away when he recognized you. Like you were ashamed. I'm not ashamed. Then why are you mopping floors? Brooks looked at these young men. These Rangers. These products of a system he'd helped build. Because someone has to mop floors. And because I did my time. I trained my soldiers. I taught my classes. I earned my retirement. What I do now is my business. Yes, sir, absolutely. Ruiz nodded. But here's the thing. That kid in there, Walker, he's 19 years old. Lost his entire fire team in that blast. He's the sole survivor. He's got shrapnel in his chest, PTSD in his head, and a long road ahead. And last night, when he was scared and hurt and didn't know if he was going to make it, you know what gave him strength? Brooks said nothing. Seeing you. Seeing a Ranger. Seeing someone who represented what he'd been through, what he'd earned, what he'd survived. You being there, even just standing in that corner, meant something to him. I was mopping floors. You were being a Ranger, whether you wanted to or not. Brooks looked at the hospital. At the building he'd cleaned for 28 years. At the life he'd built on invisibility and routine. What do you want from me? The soldiers exchanged glances. Then Ruiz pulled out a folder. Sir, there are currently 47 Rangers and Ranger-qualified soldiers being treated at this hospital. Various injuries, various stages of recovery. They're all isolated, all struggling, all dealing with their own stuff. What we'd like... He paused. What we're asking, respectfully, is if you'd consider talking to them. Not as a janitor. As a sergeant major, as one of us. I'm not qualified. Sir, you trained 4,800 Rangers. You are qualified. Brooks took the folder, opened it. Inside were photos, names, service records, 19-year-olds to 50-year-olds. Multiple wars. Multiple injuries. All Rangers. All struggling. All his, in a way. I'm not a counselor, he said finally. We're not asking you to be. We're asking you to be what you've always been. The standard. Show them that surviving isn't failing. Show them that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. Show them that a Ranger can mop floors and still be a Ranger. Brooks looked at these young men. These soldiers. These Rangers who'd come to find him because one kid in an ER had recognized something that should have stayed buried. I work midnight to 8, he said. We'll arrange visits during your breaks, and I'm still mopping floors. Nobody's asking you to stop, sir. Brooks closed the folder, looked at the hospital. At 28 years of routine about to get complicated. Rangers lead the way, he said quietly. All the way. Sergeant Major, 12 voices answered. The night shift break room at the VA hospital looked different now. The bare walls that had been empty for 28 years were now covered with photos, unit patches, challenge coins, a coffee maker that actually worked, chairs arranged in a circle instead of facing the TV, and every night at 2 a.m., during the break in the shift, Brooks's mop cart sat outside the door while inside. Rangers gathered, sometimes it was 3 of them, sometimes 15. Different faces every week as patients cycled through treatment and recovery. But they all came because word had spread. Sergeant Major Brooks was there, the legend, the standard, the man who'd trained their instructors. Brooks didn't do therapy, didn't do counseling. He just talked about Ranger School, about his time in Vietnam, about what it meant to meet the standard, about how service continued after the uniform came off, and he listened to their stories, their fears, their guilt, their struggles. He didn't judge, didn't offer easy answers, just listened with the patience of a man who'd heard it all before. Tonight, Corporal Travis Walker sat in the circle. 3 months post-surgery, scars healing, PTSD not healing as fast. He'd been coming to these meetings since he could walk again. Sergeant Major, Walker said during a lull in conversation. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Why'd you really become a janitor? I mean, you could have done anything. Could have stayed in. Could have been an instructor at Bragg or Campbell. Could have been a civilian contractor making 6 figures. Why mop floors? Brooks was quiet for a long moment. The other Rangers waited. They'd all wondered the same thing. Because I was tired, Brooks said finally. 23 years of training men to kill and survive and lead. 23 years of watching kids become soldiers. Some came back. Some didn't, and I carried every one of them. Every failure. Every success. Every soldier who died with my training in his head. He paused. I needed to do something where the worst thing that could happen was a dirty floor, where I didn't have to make life or death decisions, where I could just exist, without the weight. But you're carrying us anyway, Walker said. These meetings, the time you spend, you never stopped carrying us. That's different. How? Because now you're choosing to be carried. You're asking for help. That's not weight. That's brotherhood. One of the other Rangers, a staff sergeant who'd lost both legs to an IED, spoke up. Sergeant Major, you know what you taught me? Through my RI, but still you. You taught me that falling isn't failing. That the standard isn't about being perfect. It's about getting back up. Every time, Brooks nodded. That's the Ranger standard. Not perfection. Persistence. And you're living it, Walker said. You're showing us that you can fall from sergeant major to janitor and still be standing. Still be serving. Still be a ranger. Sir, that's the most important lesson you ever taught. Brooks looked around the circle. At these young men and women. These wounded warriors. These rangers who'd come through hell and were trying to figure out what came next. You want to know what I've learned mopping floors for 28 years? He said. They nodded. I learned that there's no such thing as an unimportant job. Every job done right serves someone. I learned that invisibility isn't weakness. Sometimes it's wisdom. I learned that you can change uniforms without changing who you are. He paused. And I learned that Rangers never stop leading the way. We just choose different ways to lead. The meeting went another 30 minutes. When it broke up, Brooks grabbed his mop cart and went back to work. Floors still needed cleaning. Bathrooms still needed scrubbing. The work didn't stop just because he'd spent an hour with his rangers, but now, as he mopped, he wasn't alone. 2 or 3 soldiers usually walked with him, talking, helping, just being present. The invisible janitor wasn't invisible anymore, and somehow that was okay. The VA Hospital Employee of the Year ceremony was not something Brooks had ever expected to attend. But hospital administration had insisted, and when administration insisted, you went. He stood on the small stage in the cafeteria, uncomfortable in a button-down shirt instead of his coveralls, while the hospital director read a citation that made him want to disappear for 29 years of dedicated service, for maintaining the highest standards of cleanliness and care, and for his volunteer work with our veteran patients, particularly those recovering from combat injuries. Daniel Brooks represents the best of what it means to serve, in uniform and out of it. Polite applause from hospital staff who still mostly thought of him as the janitor. But in the back of the room, a different group was standing. 30 Rangers in dress uniform, more than had ever gathered in this hospital at one time. They weren't applauding politely. They were standing at attention, and as Brooks stepped down from the stage, they moved as one, raising their right hands in salute. 30 Rangers. Saluting a janitor, Brooks stopped, looked at them. These soldiers he'd never directly trained but had influenced through the instructors he'd shaped. These young men and women who'd recognized that service transcended rank and uniform and job title. He straightened his back, squared his shoulders, and returned the salute, sharp, precise, the way he'd done it 1,000 times before. "Rangers lead the way," he said, his voice carrying across the cafeteria. "All the way." "Sergeant Major," 30 voices answered. The hospital staff didn't understand what they were seeing, but it didn't matter. This wasn't for them. This was for the kid who'd recognized him in the ER, for the soldiers who'd shown up in the parking lot, for every ranger who'd learned that the standard wasn't about where you served, but how you served. Brooks picked up his Employee of the Year plaque, looked at it. 29 years of mopping floors, compressed into a piece of cheap wood and brass. He walked over to the Rangers, to his Rangers. They parted to let him through, still at attention. Staff Sergeant Ruiz stepped forward. "Proud of you, Sergeant Major." "I just mop floors, Ruiz." "No, sir. You set the standard, same as always. You just do it with a mop now instead of a Ranger tab." Brooks looked at these young soldiers, these products of a system he'd helped build, these living examples of the standard he'd spent a lifetime teaching. "You know what the real Ranger standard is?" he said. "What's that, sir?" "It's not about being the toughest or the strongest or the most decorated. It's about being there, showing up, doing the job, taking care of the people around you, whether that's in Ranger School or in a hospital hallway at 3 a.m. He paused. "Rangers don't quit. We just find new ways to serve." "Yes, Sergeant Major." Brooks headed for the door. He had a shift starting in 30 minutes. Floors to mop, bathrooms to clean, Rangers to talk to during his 2 a.m. break. The work never stopped, but neither did the service. And that, more than any tab or rank or recognition, was what it meant to be a Ranger.